it's time to record my film reveal video. This is where I look at my film for the first time for my winter trip. This is a little bit different from past trips because usually as soon as I get back from the trip, I drop off the film at my local lab. Within 2-3 days or so, I get the film back, I can sit down, look at the film. But it has been 1 month since I have returned from my trip. When I dropped the film off at the lab, they told me that their E6 machine for large format film, it was down. They were kind of working on it. They didn't quite have a feeling for when it'd be up again. So I asked a couple friends of mine who they send their film to, and I sent it to a lab up in Michigan. And so I've now received the film, so it's time to take a look at it and kind of record my first reaction when seeing the film. I've actually already edited the first 4 videos for the trip. I've edited it with no clue as far as what the photos actually look like. So let's go ahead and take a look at the film and see how it turned out. So we'll start by looking at the color slide film. So this is actually one of the first scenes I photographed. This is when I went to Death Valley for the first 2 days of the trip. And I found this scene, I really like these bushes here, how they kind of repeat off kind of into the background there. The sand there, you get these kind of nice little ripples, and I set up the composition the day before, and then I decided to kind of go and do a blue hour sort of photo. So, pretty decent overall. I do like the kind of the dark blue sky there, a little bit of warm light hitting the dune. Now it was really windy when I was working with this, so I really wouldn't be surprised if there's some wind shaking them, but I have several sheets of film. I will say this one actually looks pretty darn good. That's actually really sharp. So this is with my 240 millimeter Fuji lens, and I like that. In these harsh areas where you have all these rocks and sand and stuff, just that the blue hour light, the light, you know, before sunrise and after sunset, it's just a really light, nice, it's a very nice light. It's a very dimensional light, a low angle, warm tones and then cool tones. So that's pretty good. And the moon on here, it's a little weird because it was definitely moving during the exposure. So it's a little bit oblong, but I might be able to kind of squish that back down and make it a little bit more round. But certainly kind of a cool way to start things out. This is a photo I took in Zion. Now I didn't record any video when I was shooting this because it would have just been a little bit too much to sort of try to do all at once. And so basically it was some ice and it kind of froze and then thawed, then refroze. And in this part here kind of submerged it a little bit and some fresh ice kind of locked it all in place. So you get these really cool lines and textures. I have, I believe, 2 different compositions of this scene here. So I spit on my film. I should also mention that the film is in a protective sleeve here. So sometimes people will say, hey, you shouldn't touch your film like that. Well, it's protected. I can spit on it all I want here. But let's see how we do as far as sharpness. It's looking really good. So this was a fairly straightforward scene as far as camera movements because it's really just a matter of just getting the plane of focus to follow a piece of ice, which is inherently quite flat. Camera placement is sometimes a little bit tricky. Some things I was sort of trying to keep an eye on when composing the photo. Up here in this corner here, there's a distracting little bit right there, so I was trying to keep that out of the shot. Paying close attention to this right here in relation to the corner, that distance there, that distance there. And I'll have some more sheets of film of this as well, but it's kind of cool abstract. That's kind of cool. So this is kind of, because I was curious how this would turn out because this is frozen mud ripples. So it was damp, then it froze. Along with some water that's frozen, and there's some flowing water back through here. And to the eye, when I was there, this was rather kind of tan in color. But I know that when you shoot, this is Velvia I shot, when you shoot Velvia in those sort of conditions, Stuff in the shadows oftentimes goes a little bit towards the bluer side. And then this is reflected light from a cliff in the background, which is going to go really warm because it's kind of a copper colored light. And it's really interesting how you have kind of a warm and cool thing going on. There's some diagonal emphasis here, which is kind of cool. See how I did for focus? Yeah, it's sharp. It's so cool to see how this looks. It's one of the cool things about shooting transparency film. I like that. I do have another composition of the same scene as well, where I'm just kind of working this area here. That's cool. This is not a bad way to start out a trip. Here's that scene again. So this one, this is on Provia. This is a little less saturated than the other one. Our moon is a little bit more fixed, so my exposure time is a bit shorter. Let's see how we're doing for sharpness here, because it was really windy. It looks to be pretty decent. I probably won't really know until I scan them. But that was a cool scene. I should have this on Velvia as well. But something about like these rocks here, these angles, these diagonals, and all the sand, that kind of reminded me of like Mount Rainier or something along those lines. But it's kind of cool. You got these lines here, sweeps down, these kind of sweep in like that. So a lot of motion there. And it's cool the way the moon dropped back behind the mountains like that, because I was not anticipating that when I was setting up the composition. So it was a nice little bonus. No fake moons. All right, so this is the Velvia. Exposure here is a little bit darker, but that's fine. Because I have all the detail I need. And it's really interesting because you have this really nice warm light here as it's setting back there. And I decided to do Velvia here just to kind of, because I knew it would emphasize that. Provia goes a little bit more bluish greenish. Velvia can go a little warmer sometimes. And this is Velvia 50. And that does appear to be very sharp. I won't really know until I fully scan it, but it does look pretty good. I don't have quite as much of the color contrast between this area here and the sky, but that's a nice soothing color. How do you like that? Very cool. So far I'm pretty happy with what I see. Okay, so this is gotta be the first one I did. Provia. The moon was moving a fair amount during that exposure. And the light on the scene is actually quite nice. Still rather bluish with some warm light hitting here. But yeah, the moon's definitely a distraction there. If I cover that up, it's actually pretty decent. I'm sure the other ones will be better, but actually this one's got some wind shake to it. But that does not surprise me because it was incredibly windy. The other ones will be better, but yeah, that moon was moving. And I think on this one, now that I look at the moon there, I think I started the exposure and then I held the dark slide in front of the lens for a little bit when it was really windy, and then I pulled it away, and that's why you see the moon there, and then the moon is moving there, and there's a bit of kind of a gap in the middle. But definitely pretty happy to find that scene there. All right, so we're in Zion again. This one's really dark. I'm not sure exactly what happened here. I was metering off this little bit right here for my highlights. And I was trying to set that to be just under 2 stops over. But clearly I think I had stopped down my lens a little bit for the first one, but then maybe I accidentally left it stopped down a little too far. way underexposed. But I have this one on Velvia as well. I will say that the light over here is kind of cool. You get this nice warm reflected light hitting there, kind of blue light on the back. But interesting scene. Hopefully I have some better exposures of that one. This is Velvia as well. This exposure appears to be a little bit better, maybe not a lot. Again, some nice light hitting there. That's really dark. I shot this on color neg as well, so hopefully the color neg turned out pretty decent. I mean, I shot that within about a half hour of arriving at Zion, so it's cool I can find something that fast. This one's not bad. So this one's still Velvia. My exposure is way better on this one. Now, I do remember that when I shot this, I took one at f51 and was about a second long exposure. And then I dropped in some NDs and did some longer exposures, which I bet is what those other ones were. But maybe I left it at f51. I didn't stop it. I didn't open it back up to f45. Because that would explain it. This one's not bad, but I think the color neg will be better. Because this is more what I was expecting for the exposure. Probably would have been a bad idea to shoot a little Provia on that one as well. All right. So there's a Velvia shot of this really big rock that I found when I was in Death Valley, and the wind was kind of eating away the sand there. And since this is Velvia, this is probably an exposure I did a little bit earlier on, kind of early in the blue hour time. And it's okay. That's how I did for sharpness. Okay, so that's about what I expected. So my plane of focus is kind of skimming slightly under this sand here. I mean, it's getting this decently, but it's more so kind of capturing this area here and then skimming over the top of that. So I was able to do okay with it. The light's okay. I have some Provia shots as well that hopefully are a bit better. But it was so windy that day. It was really windy. This one's rather underexposed. So these are some cool sort of rocks in this creek bed. And they're all arranged there because of the flow of water in the past. And it kind of reminded me of like migratory birds flying around. But I am like almost a stop underexposed on this one. I mean, the good thing is I have detail in the snow. I have detail in the rocks, so I've got detail there, but that's just dark. So, I mean, if need be, if I really like this photo, I could scan it and I have all the detail I need. But it definitely comes through rather dark. I think I shot this one on color neg as well. All right, next up, the same scene, also on Velvia there. And this one might be a little brighter than the last one. I think the light was changing a little bit when I was shooting these. Yeah, they're about the same. It's just not all that exciting, but maybe once I scan it, maybe I'll have sort of a different perception of it. I mean, it's an interesting pattern. Actually, the more you look at it, it's kind of trippy in a way. So we'll see. I'll have to scan it. But it's a little weird how my exposure is a little on the dark side. So here's that ice again. And this is the same composition as the first one because I see that this is in the upper right corner. Got my little distracting element here I'm trying to work around. It's kind of cool. It kind of reminded me when I was shooting this, it reminded me of like a road as viewed from above with a kind of like a icy, snowy landscape. This one's on Velvia. Got my little notch right there. And it's kind of cool. Definitely a very cool scene. Shots like this from a technical standpoint aren't that tricky as far as camera movements because you just are trying to make the plane of focus follow the surface of the ice. But the tricky part is sometimes getting the camera exactly where it needs to be. And then once you have it set up, trying not to like kick a tripod leg or something along those lines. But how do you like that? It's pretty cool. So this is the different composition of that same scene because I'm looking at that corner up there. So a couple things we're looking at here. First of all, Provia versus Velvia. Velvia has kind of a magenta-y cast. Provia is probably a little more true to the scene, but a little bit more on the green side. So it's kind of interesting to see that comparison there. Not the exact same composition, but the same scene. I think I like this maybe a little better because you got a little more space in this corner here. The line kind of moves around. I was paying close attention to that space there, that space there. Got some interesting kind of lines in there as well. So I think I like this I believe this is the second composition I did because I was able to completely get rid of that little distracting element there by kind of moving the camera a little bit. And see if we're sharp. We are. Cool, you see all the little ice crystals in there, all the little bubbles. That's cool. Very cool. It was nice when that stuff turns out. Another variation, this one's a little darker. This isn't the first composition of that scene, based on where that is. A little distracting element there. But I think the light was changing as I was shooting. So I think it got a little darker as the sun was moving around and wasn't bouncing off the cliffs in quite the same way, or there may have been some clouds or something as well. But I think I like the second composition I did on that scene. Here's that rock again. It's just not all that. I was hoping it to be a little more dramatic, a little more shadow in here to really highlight this edge, these sand ripples here, but this one was probably still taken a little earlier on. I see it's Provia. I shot some as it was getting later and later, so maybe those will be a little bit more dramatic. It's okay. In all reality, I was just trying to find something to point my camera at that day. So this is to be one that was taken a little bit later on, because now you actually see we have these ridges here where the light is catching that. Building a little more contrast in here, picking out some interesting kind of patterns there. But I just don't know if it's compelling enough of a photo. I do enjoy the process of setting up a composition though. You have to kind of think through the edges, how everything's going to relate in the composition. And it definitely felt good to expose some film that day, even if it's not necessarily what I will be using. I like this a little bit better than the previous one, because this one we're starting to build a little more contrast. I think that light angle is getting a little bit lower, so there's like just a little bit of warmth on the horizon there after the sun had set. So this is probably the best of the bunch. This is also Provia, and I was doing some fairly long exposures at times. I don't really remember how long this exposure was, but I mean, it's technically a decent image. It's probably one I'll have to sit on for a little while and see how it all pans out. But interesting. So this is a scene I photographed in Death Valley on my return trip. And I like the scene because you had all these diagonal lines I was able to kind of get to work in the scene, or it kind of breaks up the composition a little bit. And there's some interesting patterns here. The light is really not very interesting on this one. Now this scene, if I remember right, I photographed it from when there was still direct sunlight hitting the mud tiles to kind of the blue hour. So maybe this is kind of a transitional time because I'm not getting much warmth in these areas here, which means it's probably not like a full-on blue hour shot where you have skylight coming from here and then kind of warm twilight coming in this way. So maybe this is kind of a transitional time. Interesting subject, but the light's not all that great, but hopefully I've got something better for that. This one is a bit better. And I think this is exactly what I was talking about. I think this was taken after that last photo, because if you'll notice, you'll see there's some warm light hitting right in here. Yet we have some kind of cool light, some blue light coming from this way. You get a little blue light on there. This is on Provia, so it's a little bit of a lower contrast film than Velvia, and I think I also have it on Velvia. It's a pretty decent shot. Has a very 3D look. The mud tiles are kind of curved up, which is kind of neat. And it's harder to find compositions there than you'd think because it's so chaotic and your mind just has a hard time making sense of it because you see these same patterns over and over again. Let me check sharpness. That's really sharp. That's really sharp. Again, not too tricky of a photo because it's one plane. And you just try to get the plane of focus just to follow along the plane of the mud. Cool with that? So also Provia. I'm thinking this one was probably taken well after sunset because now you're getting kind of more of a magenta kind of light, which is kind of like what we saw on one of the last photos with the big boulder with the sand around it. Because you get this kind of magenta light. I don't have much of an impact from the blue light there. But it's interesting. The difference in just a little bit of time makes with these photos. Where here you have kind of a good mixture, still pretty neutral. Then here it goes quite warm. I think I prefer this because you have kind of a warm, cool thing going on. But interesting nonetheless. And this one's a bit underexposed. This is Velvia. I mean, I kind of treated them the same as when I was exposing it, but now also, you notice here we have some direct sunlight hitting it because you see some shadows there. So this is before the sun had dropped below the horizon. And typically I don't do a lot of shooting in this kind of light just because with Velvia, which I normally use, it's really hard to show the bright areas and the dark areas, and it's pretty decent, but it's not, I think I prefer the sort of the blue hour light on it. Really good texture there though. All right, next up. Okay, now this is interesting. So this is on Provia, and this was probably taken very similar time. This one was taken a little later, because if you look at that shadow there versus that shadow there, this one's closer to the edge, so the sun angle was lower. And Provia handled that scene so much nicer. What's really weird is that I was using the same general metering technique when working with these two films, and the same general exposure, I mean, accounting for the difference in film speed of a 100-speed film versus a 50-speed film, but that would all have been taken into consideration. But you just have less contrast with the Provia. And with this one, you have this really nice warm tones here that's catching, and then you have some really nice kind of cool tones in here. I really like that. So that gives it really a nice sense of depth, which is pretty cool here. I like these shadows, I like the ridges, the light areas, the kind of blue areas. I feel like there's a little bit of a color cast going on here that I can improve on a little bit when I scan it, but so far that's my favorite, and I wouldn't have guessed that. I would have thought it would be kind of the blue hour just because the light can be pretty harsh, but I like that. It's pretty cool. All right. So again, that same scene. Let's see if we can figure out. This one was taken after this one. Because again, looking at the distance and the shadows there, I believe, it kind of makes sense. So yeah, I mean, if we look at those two scenes, I mean, Velvia is fine, but I think Provia is doing better. We'll see how that compares once I get scanned. But I feel like I underexposed that one. But it's good because I have it on Provia. And then that's a bit on the bright side. So I was just driving around this morning. I was trying to find something to point my camera at. And I saw there were some clouds there and saw that there are probably a good chance of some light hitting the mountains. And it's one of the things where the sun is rising, it kind of rises up over the horizon on the out to the east. And then you have a low bank of clouds there where it's just going to pass, over the mountain, or it's going to go rise above the mountain, and then it's going to be up in the clouds pretty soon. So you have this really narrow gap. And so I was just driving around and found an area where I can point a long lens. I'm a little bright there. I mean, technically it's probably okay, but I'm definitely a bit on the bright side. I could probably make it work if I needed to, but I would need to darken the whole thing down a bit because I'm a little washed out. And maybe if I kind of darken down the clouds a little bit, put a little more emphasis there. But the foreground, I have good, pretty much a perfect exposure in the foreground. I think I used like a 2-stop grad on this. But I'm a little bright there, but I mean, it could work. This is the same scene. I think I like this one better because if you look at this, we have the sun hitting the mountains, but not the snow. So it's kind of like this nice little helping hand from nature in order to give better exposure. I also feel like the clouds are a little better. Is there a difference in the... Nah, the clouds are basically the same. But yeah, I think on this one, my exposure is really good. It needs to be darkened down a little bit. I try to expose about as bright as I can without blowing the highlights, and I can darken down so that I'm not losing detail in the shadows. This is kind of cool here. I like the way there's this alluvial fan here. It really shows a scale because these are huge. But these patterns, those patterns, I have a good exposure there. I think if I were to darken things down a little bit and then have a little bit of a gradient here just to keep the eye in the frame, just kind of darken the sky down up here a little bit where the clouds are. Kind of like that shot. Not bad for just driving around and seeing something on the side of the road. And Provia handled the color really nice. It's cool. Right. So this was kind of an interesting scene. So I got these coyote tracks through here and found a bush. I just centered it right in the middle. And I shot the entire progression of this sunset. And this was right as the last little bit of sun was hitting those mountains. I used a 2-stop soft grad filter just to help control that a little bit. And my exposure was quite good there. And I have pretty much an ideal exposure on those mountains. And everything else is quite good too. Not bad. We'll see how the other ones do from that scene. I shot a lot of film on that scene. Okay, so this was the progression. This was the next one I shot, where now the shadows kind of starting to creep up those mountains there. And this will be one where I'll have to scan it to kind of get a better feeling for it. But it's amazing how fast that light moves. But I like the story aspect of having the coyote track there. So I'm gonna, if it's a shot that I like that makes it to my portfolio, I'm going to name it something having to do with the coyote and the mud flats or something, just to kind of draw attention to that. So this was kind of a sunset-y sort of light of that same scene. It's not all that exciting. There really wasn't a huge display of color. I think I took my grad filter, I think I moved it up a bit to make sure I get just maybe a little bit up in the sky, which seems like it was a good decision. I do like this cloud being kind of diagonal there. The light in the foreground is not all that interesting, but it's not bad. It's calm light. But it's decent. Again, it was a pretty short-lived moment there. Well, this is kind of cool. So this is twilight. So this is after sunset. You see a hint of clouds in the sky there, but they're not getting lit up by the sun because the sun's already been down for a little while. But now the foreground's really coming alive. So look at that difference. We have, I guess I can kind of do something along these lines here. We have all this nice dimensionality, cool light, some warm light, versus this is just brown with cracks in it. So from a lighting standpoint, that's better. So, I mean, I love Blue Hour because you get this calm, even light, evens out the exposure real nice. What's cool is you can see there's one paw print right there, right before that coyote started going through all that muck. See how we are for sharpness? It looks quite good. It's very, very sharp. Yeah, also see some areas where he or she, whatever, the coyote was dragging its paws through that thick mud. I like that. Very simple, but very calm light. And the light is so important when it comes to landscape photography. It's one of my favorites so far. All right, up next. Okay, now this is going to make things a little bit tricky for me. Because this is kind of the foreground of this one isn't quite as dynamic as the foreground of this one. Because this one you have a little more of that warm, cool thing going on. And even just if you look at this bush right here, it's being hit by light coming from a lower angle. Here the light's kind of more coming from there. But obviously we got a sky full of some pretty crazy color there. And the mountains are a little bit more, you have kind of warm light in the mountains, cool light on the sky. That's gonna be a tricky one. I think I'm gonna have to scan these and see what really looks better. Because I like this foreground. I like that sky. That's how they'd look like if they were underexposed. That's a tricky one. To me, this shot's more about the foreground than the sky. So I think this one does better because it puts the emphasis where it needs to be. If anything, this is kind of distracting from that, but I'll have to scan those, get a feeling for them. And then this one was a little bit earlier on in the sunset. Not as interesting light on the bush, not as interesting light on the foreground. Good exposure for the mountains. Actually, let's look at this area right here. I've got detail there. So if this is the only one I had, I'd be okay with it, but it really shows the value of sticking through a sunset all the way through and get that nice twilight, because you don't have to have as dominant clouds in the sky. Your exposures are oftentimes easier. But I will have some decisions to make there, that's for sure. Another of these sort of underexposed snow shot. This will be one where maybe if I scan it, if I lighten it, maybe it pulls out more subtlety in there, some of the warm light kind of hitting the rocks there, but I'm not quite sure why I'm so dark on this one. I'm usually pretty good on metering, but also I don't have a lot of experience working with snow. I thought I was putting the snow at almost 2 stops over, but that's definitely not quite the case. But I certainly have a lot of other stuff to work with, which is good. All right, this is kind of cool. So I shot 2 compositions of this scene. I think this is the second composition I shot of it. This is a more close-up shot. I also have kind of a wider shot of it. And it's frozen mud ripples, or it was, the mud had kind of partially dried, then it froze. And you have blue light kind of hitting this. This was taken on Velvia. And then you have the really warm reflected light hitting the ice there. So it's like this really cool look to it. I used my 450 lens. I overextended the bellows in order to focus this close. This represents an area that's maybe about that big or so. That's pretty cool. I'd say my exposure is a little on the dark side, but nothing's underexposed, so the exposure is fine in that regard. And I was trying to make sure I didn't overexpose anything. But that's really cool. Very abstract. You get this warm, cool thing going on. To my eye in the scene, the sand was a little bit more of kind of a tan color, but I knew that Velvia would most likely pull out some blue tones that really separate this area from that area there. It's really cool. Also kind of a diagonal emphasis. Very cool. Another shot of that same scene. And just double check my sharpness. Man, this is so cool when you can see every single little grain of sand. Very, very sharp indeed. I love the abstract sort of nature of that. Very, very cool. Definitely worth heading over to Zion to catch all that. And then here is that, the first scene of that I already had a sheet of film from. But yeah, that's really cool. It'll be tough to kind of figure out which one I like better. I think this one's more dynamic because you have the inclusion of all the orange, the flowing water up there. These edges are really neat. And comparing these two, it's gonna be a little hard to make much sense of it right here because this one needs to be brightened up a bit. This is a better exposure. But I'll have to scan both of those and see which I like better. So fun to look at though. I'm feeling that one of those is going to end up in a box set. But I'll have to try to maybe try warming it up just a little bit. I might put a little more life in these areas here and you take down the blues just a little bit. Just a little bit, not much. Just to warm it up a little bit. So that's cool. That's actually pretty decent. I had no clue what to expect, also since it's been so long. So here's a color neg version of that tree covered in snow. And I know that these are hard for you guys to really make much sense of, just because it's always tough when viewing negatives. But if I compare these exposures, if I look at this area right here, that really bright area represents really dark shadows. This right here is a little darker, so I think I might have a little better exposure on this guy. I'll have to scan it though and see how I do. I mean, I see texture there in the snow, so it could be that between the two of them, this one's better. But I really hope I'm capturing some good light reflecting off the snow and the tree there. Pretty darn cool. So It's interesting. Looks like I did pretty well. I didn't really know what to expect going into this, and I was actually debating heading back to Death Valley a third time, which I still might do because I really want to spend some more time just kind of exploring there, kind of looking around. But I think I could do that now with the satisfaction of knowing that I've got some pretty strong work from really the first 2 parts of the trip. And I really do need to get this stuff scanned in and kind of work on the computer, get a better feeling for what I have. As I mentioned earlier, I've already edited the first 4 days for the video, so I gotta make the other days. But definitely want to thank everyone for watching, and we'll see you around next time. If you enjoy this ad-free and clickbait-free content and want to help me live my dream, a voluntary contribution of just $24 a year helps keep my gas tank full and my film freezer stocked. For more information on how to support me and my work, please visit the donation section of my website at benhorn.com/donate. I also have prints and my portfolio box set available on my website. You can find a direct link down below in the show notes. Thanks in advance for your support.